Good morning, everybody. Apologies for the slight delay. A few technical glitches just as we were trying to register everybody on the webinar. We will hopefully have resolved that technical glitch, and we'll get ready to present this webinar. Thank you all for joining and taking time out of your day to attend this experts webinar from SOCOTEC. My name's Owen Edwards. I am the Technical and Training Director for SOCOTEC Building Control. And today's webinar, we are going to take a look at the new Building Safety Act and some of the implications that might have going forwards in terms of our construction and our building regulations. But also I want to try and emphasize to you that it's a much wider act looking at the construction industry. Our timetable for today, roughly sort of 30 to 45-minute presentation, and then some times for questions and answers. You can put questions into the chat, and we'll try and get through those questions at the end of the presentation. At the end, I think we might be able to use microphones and put your hand up to ask a question if you want to open your microphone at the end of the presentation. My colleagues will open those at the end, and you can ask a question via the microphone, or as I say, just in the chat as well. So let's have a little think back to where we've come from when we're now looking at the Building Safety Act. We're all probably aware of the Grenfell Tower fire. That was a tragedy back in 2017 now, so that's 5 years ago. And from that, the government decided that they needed to do something to improve safety in the construction industry and in our built environment. And so again, you're probably all familiar with these two documents. The Building a Safer Future was the independent review of building regulations and fire safety that was written by Dame Judith Hackett, and that was published back in 2018 now, so that's 4 years that's been published for the proposals for the future, or Dame Judith Hackett's intention for what we should do. Alongside that, there was the Setting the Bar document that was published and the report made, and this was from a competence steering group for the Building a Safer Future group. And so that is looking at competence within the building and construction industry to make sure that we've got sufficient competence and sufficient people to make sure that we are building safe buildings. And so those reports were, back in 2018 and 2020, which set the background for the government to draft their building safety bill, which ran through Parliament over the last couple of years and received royal assent in 2022, and so became the Building Safety Act. Now, I don't want you to actually be able to read any of the text on this drawing, or in this slide rather, but it's just an indication that in the Building a Safer Future report back in December 2017, Dame Judith and her team had a look at the process and tried to map the process of designing a building and constructing a building and a building going into use for high-rise residential buildings. And this was the process map that they came up with. And so it's a very, very complicated, or it was a very, very complicated route to actually design, construct and occupy the building, running through all the bits of legislation that you need to follow and need to comply with. And so this actually made it really difficult for buildings to comply and for people within the industry to understand all the aspects of industry and building safety, so that they could build buildings and understand their part in the construction process, and the effect that their work might have on other aspects of compliance for the building. And so what Dame Judith and her team wanted to try and do was trying to simplify that process. And again, not expecting you to look at this. These are documents that are within the Building a Safer Future report. But to simplify that process so that you actually went through stages. We've probably all heard about the gateway stages that are being proposed, and this was the plan for the legislation and for the proposals for industry, so that we simplified that process, went through the stages of design and construction and occupation of the building, and people could understand the process and the impact that their part of the works would have on the construction of a building and the safety of a building. And this is also going to look at buildings going into the future in occupation as well, rather than just during the design and construction process. So again, trying to simplify the process. Within the Building Safety Act, the idea was that there would be a new building safety regulator. And the Health and Safety Executive have been asked to become the building safety regulator, and Peter Baker has been appointed as the Chief Inspector of Buildings within the Health and Safety Executive. With the Building Safety Act receiving royal assent and becoming the Act of 2022, that is now enshrined in the legislation, the Building Safety Regulator. And so although the Health and Safety Executive have been doing a lot of work in the meantime while the bill was running through Parliament, they were really acting in shadow form. But now the Act of Parliament has been given royal assent, then the Building Safety Regulator has come into being and can now progress with their plans for the building safety culture. And at the heart of the reforms, the Building Safety Regulator is going to operate in England and will have three main functions, and we can see those on this slide: overseeing the safety and performance of buildings, helping and encouraging the built environment industry and building control professionals to improve their competence, and leading implementation of the new regulatory framework for high-rise buildings. And I think we perhaps get a little bit distracted with that last bullet point there about leading the implementation of the new regulatory framework for high-rise buildings, because the Building Safety Regulator will become the regulator for those high-rise buildings. But as you can see, that is only one part of the building regulator's responsibilities and functions. So there's going to be an awful lot in the construction industry that the Building Safety Regulator will influence in terms of safety and performance and competence within the built environment industry as well. And at the bottom there about the Building Safety Regulator, what they will actually regulate, we are defining high-rise buildings or high-risk buildings for the Building Safety Regulator. And these are likely to be buildings with 7 or more stories or that are more than 18 metres high and have either 2 residential units, or a hospital or a care home. And so we're going to define those, and we'll have a look at that a little bit as we run through the presentation as well in a little bit more detail. The second report that I showed on my first slide about setting the bar, a new competence regime and routine for the construction industry. Part of the function and responsibilities of the Building Safety Regulator was to set up an industry competence committee, and this has been in interim format, running alongside while the Building Safety Bill has been running through Parliament, and this will become the Industry Competence Committee after it has been formally appointed. John Vanstone is the chair of the Industry Competence Committee, and the Industry Competence Committee reports back to the Competence Steering Group, which is chaired by Dame Judith Hackett. But you can see here that the changes and competence regime is going to go over the whole of the construction industry. So we're not just looking at building regulations and the building control profession in this now. We are looking at everybody. 12 working groups that have been created to look at the various players within the construction industry and the built environment. So we are covering engineers, installers, fire engineers, fire risk assessors, fire safety enforcement officers, building safety professionals, that is the building control body. And so actually for the industry competence committee, they're not actually doing the review for the building standards professionals. That is going to be carried out by the building safety regulator direct. And then we run through building designers, building safety managers, site supervisors, project managers, procurement professionals, and construction products competence. The group for building safety managers, as the Building Safety Bill ran through Parliament, there was going to be a new accountable person called a building safety manager. But that was proving very difficult to define and also to ensure that as an accountable person, they had the power and the responsibility of their role to effect changes. So the government, through consultation as the bill ran through Parliament, decided to omit the building safety manager as a duty holder. And so the Building Safety Managers Competence Group have now started to look at building owners. There's going to be a new accountable person for occupiers, and they're now looking at the work that building owners need to do in terms of making sure and demonstrating that their buildings are safe throughout the life of the buildings. So whatever part of industry you're in, whatever part of the construction industry you're in, the built environment, you need to keep an eye out with your professional bodies and your industry groups, looking out for competence regimes that are going to be introduced. I think there's an installers test pilot study going on with installers at the moment about how they are going to demonstrate their competence for carrying out various installations within buildings. So again, as we move through the next sort of few months and years, then you will be hearing an awful lot more about competence and how you are going to have to demonstrate your competence to carry out the particular work that you will be carrying out on any particular buildings. And this is not going to just apply to the high risk buildings. This is going to apply across industry. So that's the background, and that's what's been set up in the background through the Building Safety Regulator and the Industry Competence Committee for us to review. And that's been working, as I say, in the background in an interim format until the Building Safety Act received royal assent. And so we'll start to have a look at the Building Safety Act, which received royal assent in April this year, so April 2022. So this is now an Act of Parliament which can be reviewed, and the Act has 6 parts to the Act. It has an introduction and overview, has a part 2 which talks about the actual regulator, the Building Safety Regulator, and the functions of the Building Safety Regulator. Part 3 is quite an extensive part of the Building Safety Act, as that introduces amendments to the Building Act 1984. So this Act of Parliament is not replacing the Building Act. It is an additional Act of Parliament in addition to the Building Act 1984, but does make extensive amendments to the Building Safety Act. Part 4 is the higher risk buildings. And this is providing a new part of regulation to ensure that the higher risk buildings, our blocks of flats, our tall blocks of flats, are actually regulated throughout the life of the building. Prior to this, there's been no continuing control over blocks of flats. Once they've been built and completed and they go into occupation, there's no authority that actually has a continuing control over the whole fire safety and structural safety of the building as a whole. There are parts that are controlled under the regulatory form order, so the common areas are controlled. Environmental health have some control over the standards within the flats, but there was no overarching control for the building. So this part 4 introduces that new regime which the building safety regulator will take over. Part 5 is some other provisions about safety standards, and then part 6 has some general provisions in terms of interpretation and things like that. So we'll start to have a look at these parts in a little bit more detail. As I mentioned, part 1 is just really the introduction and telling us what we've got in the Building Safety Act. Part 2, as listed there, contains provisions about the Building Safety Regulator. And it's worth noting at this point that this applies to buildings in England in terms of the Building Safety Regulator and its functions. As I mentioned, Part 3 amends the Building Act, and amendments made by Part 3 provide that the regulator is the Building Control Authority in England for higher risk buildings, and require the regulator and the Welsh ministers to establish and maintain registers of building control approvers. We'll have a look at some of this in a little bit more detail later on in the presentation. But it's worth noting at this point that the Building Safety Act has introduced the Building Safety Regulator and given functions to the Building Safety Regulator, who will actually only act within England. But it does give powers to the Welsh ministers to make regulations that will have similar sort of effects within Wales. But it's worth noting again that for those of you who work across England and Wales, that there will be a slightly different timetable for regulations being made, and we will need to keep an eye out for regulations made via the Welsh Assembly by the Welsh ministers for buildings in Wales. As I mentioned, Part 4 is about the occupied higher risk buildings in England. So again, this is not applicable to Wales and the duties that are going to be imposed on the accountable persons. And then Part 5, which we'll have a look at later as well, has some further provisions about remediation redress, new homes ombudsman, construction products, fire safety provision, and provision about the regulation of architects as well, some additional regulations in that. So we'll start to have a look at those parts in a little bit more detail. Part 2 of the Act introduces the regulator and its functions. So the regulator has all of these duties and functions to be carried out. So it has the duty to facilitate building safety. So that's in relation to those higher risk buildings. Has a duty to keep safety and standard of buildings under review. And so that is throughout the construction industry. This is not just related to higher risk buildings. So the safety and standard of buildings is across the board. So it covers all of the buildings in our built environment. The Building Safety Regulator has got a duty to facilitate improvement in the competency of industry and building inspectors. And again, when we look at that Industry Competence Committee, we can see the breadth of that competence that they're going to be looking at. And so we are going to be looking at the whole of industry, demonstrating their competence for carrying out works on different types of buildings. And as I think there's probably been a lot of talk about this in the press about registering building inspectors within the building control community. We're very well aware that the Building Safety Regulator is going to be registering individual building inspectors and then also registering approved inspectors who will become known as building control approvers. The Building Safety Regulator is also having to make proposals and consultations relating to regulations. So the Building Safety Regulator will have an overview of regulations within the built environment and will make recommendations to the Secretary of State for any new regulations or amendment regulations that are to be made. They will have a duty to establish a system for giving building safety information. So again, they're going to be looking at regulations to make sure that building safety information is given to the people who occupy and who maintain and operate buildings. And so there will be a system that will be established via the building safety regulator for that. There's a committee at the moment that advises the Secretary of State called the Building Regulations Advisory Committee. And that is a committee that just advises the Secretary of State directly. The Building Safety Regulator is going to be required to set up a Building Advisory Committee, so it'll have slightly broader remit, I suspect, than just building regulations. But again, that Building Advisory Committee will then sort of make proposals for regulations to be made by the Secretary of State. We've mentioned the Committee on Industry Competence. There's an interim committee already set up, and the Building Safety Regulator will make that committee a formal committee on industry competence. And so that work will continue over the coming years to improve competence throughout the industry. Residents are going to have a bigger voice in the safety of their buildings, and the Building Safety Regulator is going to be required to set up systems for resident panels to operate in buildings. The Building Safety Regulator must create a strategic plan for the future of their proposals, and they will be reporting that to ministers in the future. And then there's also a requirement to develop a mandatory reporting system so that building safety risks can be reported to the Building Safety Regulator. And these are likely to be about mandatory incidents that have to be reported. So as you can see, the Building Safety Regulator, it's not just about higher risk buildings, it's about industry competence and the safety of the construction industry as a whole, and the safety of the built environment as a whole as well. Part 3 of the Building Safety Act. This is an extensive part which extends to something like about 58 pages of legislation, and this is making amendments to the Building Act 1984. And so this has 3 main areas that it makes amendments, and it makes amendments in relation to building control authorities and the building regulations. It makes amendments about building control approvers, currently known as approved inspectors, and building inspectors. And building inspectors are any individuals that work in building control, and so that would be working for either approved inspectors, local authority, or in the future for the Building Safety Regulator. And then there's some other miscellaneous provisions and general amendments that need to be made in terms of the Building Act, where we're looking at some various fees and charges, about some levies that might be made on building control approvals, so that funding can be made for the remediation works that are going on at the moment. But if we have a look at some of those amendments that might be made or that have been made to the Building Act. And we're talking about building control authorities, so we'll have the different building control authorities that can enforce building regulations. We've got an overarching higher risk building category within the Building Act, but what that does is it actually allows the Secretary of State to make regulations to define those higher risk buildings. We can see there as we go down, we've got a lapse of building control approval. Then there's a proposal to amend that so that initial notices will automatically lapse after 3 years. And then as we go down through the enforcement processes, there's a proposal to introduce things called compliance and stop notices to allow enforcement authorities to actually serve notice about compliance and requiring compliance to be made, and then also to serve stop notices so that they can actually stop construction or they can stop work on buildings until they are satisfied that the building regulations are going to be carried out. The building control approvers and building inspectors. So there's a new section which starts to set out the regulation of the building control profession, and that's where we're going to see registration of individual building inspectors and registration of building control approvers, as I say, currently known as approved inspectors. There's going to be work that is going to be for higher risk building work, for registered building control approvers, and we're going to look at how to transfer over to the building safety regulator. So the framework for all of these subsequent regulations to be made is set out in Part 3 of the Building Safety Act, but this is just making extensive amendments to the Building Act 1984. Part 4 of the Act is to do with the higher risk buildings, and is to do with the higher risk buildings in occupation. So this is the new part of regulation and control of our higher risk buildings that is coming in via the building safety regulator. So it'll define what is a building safety risk. At the moment, the consideration is that building safety risk will be around fire safety and structural safety, rather than any other safety risks in buildings. But in the legislation, it gives us a framework that will allow allow regulations to be made in the future, should building safety risks be identified, that the building safety regulator considers should be part of the risk assessment. We've got the meaning of higher risk building, and it's slightly different in Part 4 of the Act than it is going to be within the Building Act. And the difference is that hospitals and care homes are actually controlled or supervised over in occupation via the CQC system of quality, the Care Quality Commission. So the higher risk buildings for in occupation under the Building Safety Act are going to be the buildings that contain 2 or more dwellings with more than 7 stories or a height greater than 18 meters. And this is a new category, as I mentioned earlier, a new category of building which is going to have the control during occupation. Within the Act, we've got the new accountable person. This is a new duty holder, and there will be an accountable person for these buildings, and the accountable person will have duties to maintain the safety of these buildings throughout occupation. There'll be a requirement for these buildings to be registered, and the building safety regulator will arrange and organise a registration where the accountable person must apply for registration and apply for a certificate for occupying the building. They won't be allowed to occupy the building unless they have this registration and a certificate to confirm that they are able to occupy the building. The duties on accountable persons are in relation to safety risks, and as I've said, at the moment safety risks are going to be identified as fire safety and structural safety. But there's also duties relating to information and documents. So you've probably heard the term golden thread of information that has been used throughout the consultation and throughout the review by Dame Judith. And this is an important aspect that people are going to have to retain information and documents about buildings. They're going to have to show that they are keeping these documents up to date, because buildings that are required to be registered are going to have to go through a re-registration process every so many years, say possibly 5-10 years or something like that. And part of that re-registration process will be a demonstration that you're retaining and keeping up to date information and documents about safety risks. And part of that documentation is making sure that you inform the occupants of the buildings as to how to operate and maintain their parts of the buildings so that they don't adversely affect building safety risks. As I mentioned, there's going to be a requirement to have engagement with residents, so residents will have a greater voice in safety risks for their buildings and making sure that information is provided for that. But alongside that, that greater voice, Residents will have duties imposed on them as well, and they mustn't adversely affect the safety of those buildings. So they can't carry out works that would adversely affect the safety of the buildings. So along with that greater voice, they will have some duties as well to make sure that they're not adversely affecting the building. There's legislation about enforcement, about special measures that the Building Safety Regulator can impose, and then we have information about appeals and landlord and tenant information as well. And so that is all within Part 4 of the Act, which is going to be applicable to those to the buildings in occupation. Part 5 is where we start to look at some other provisions that have been recommended and are going to be brought in. So some of this remediation and redress, what we're hearing at the moment, Michael Gove is talking to housing industry and talking about making sure that the existing buildings that need remediation have the necessary remediation carried out, and also talking about the funding and how the funding will work for the remediation of those existing buildings. But this remediation process will also go into the future. Hopefully it wouldn't be necessary with a stricter regime, but if there are any necessary measures for remediation, then remediation is going to be covered within the Building Safety Act. The Building Safety Act requires a new homes ombudsman to be created, and this is about to be created. I'm not sure that it's actually in being at the moment, but the New Homes Quality Board have been asked to set up the New Homes Ombudsman as a body, and this is where people who've got new homes, and again this is not just applicable to high-rise, this is applicable to all new homes, and it's an ombudsman that can take complaints from residents or from new home owners about the quality and standard of their homes. There's legislation about construction products, and so the information about construction products, the information that manufacturers produce, about safety information, about the use of their products, there's going to be regulations and legislation about the construction products and what they've got to produce and statements they've got to make about construction products. The fire safety aspects, there are amendments that are being made to the Fire Safety Act and the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, and I think these have just had some regulations made which have brought these into effect, which are starting to look and introduce the risk assessment to include the external walls of high-risk buildings, and also to include things like the flat entrance doors. There was always some debate as to how far the Regulatory Reform Order covered in terms of blocks of flats. It was generally accepted that it covered the common areas of flats, but there was some sort of question mark over flat entrance doors, etc. There's some legislation about architects, mentioned about some greater requirements through the Architects Registration Board, and registration of architects and competence of architects is going to be reviewed via some amendment legislation here. And then a housing complaint system as well. So there'll be a requirement to set up a housing complaint system. So what are the next steps that we're going to look at? So the next steps are going to be consultations on regulations. There were some draft regulations that were on the website as the Building Safety Bill went through Parliament. Those have now been taken off the website, as the next stage will be consultations on these. And these will cover things like the higher risk buildings descriptions, industry competence and duty holders. It will talk about architects and fees for services, and it will introduce some new regulations. There'll be some new regulations over that. It talks about regulations for restricted activities and functions. We'll have a look at some of those as we run through the next few slides. Building safety fees regulations are going to be consulted on, and also the construction products regulations. And then we'll be looking at our higher risk buildings regulations and the higher risk buildings prescribed principles for management of building safety risks. The first of those consultations is what you see on the right-hand side there, the consultation on the higher risk buildings, descriptions and supplementary provisions regulations. So over the next 12 months, we're going to see an awful lot of consultations on new regulations that are going to come through. So we need to keep an eye out for those. And then just looking at the timeline before we start to look at some of the details of how those new regulations might impact our processes and procedures. The Building Safety Act came in April 2022. By April next year, the fire safety order changes are in. I think they might already be in now, but they've come in early. And then by April 2023, the Architects Registration Board powers are going to be increased about registering architects and about the competence, architects demonstrating competence to the Architects Registration Board. And then by October next year, there's going to be the mandatory registration of building inspectors and building control approvers. We're going to introduce the Gateway 2 and Gateway 3 process, which is the plan approval and completion of construction prior to occupation. The mandatory registration of those higher risk buildings is going to come in by October. And then there's going to be new duties on the accountable person, as we've discussed. That golden thread of information, our information about our building safety aspects, is going to be needed to be demonstrated for that registration process. The mandatory occurrence reporting system and the developer levy are all due to be introduced by October 2023. So you can see it's going to be a really busy 12 to 18 months in terms of legislation and new systems being set up. So let's have a quick look through some of the implications that might have. Looking at the design and construction process. Design and construction stage, we're going to have the new building control authority of the building safety regulator for the higher risk buildings, and then the local authority are staying as the building control authority for all other buildings. And so as the authority, those are the bodies that can take enforcement action if building regulations are deemed to be breached. For building control bodies, then the building safety regulator will become the building control body for higher risk buildings. So applications for higher risk building work will need to be submitted to the building safety regulator. And then other types of buildings that are not the higher risk buildings, similar systems as we have now for the local authority and building control approvers, as I say, currently approved inspectors, can carry out work as the building control body on other buildings other than higher risk buildings. However, regulations are going to be made which will restrict activities and functions. And these are things like plan certificates, final certificates, inspections of work. And those building control bodies are going to need to have a recommendation from a registered building inspector in order to carry out those restricted functions. So before issuing a plan certificate or a final certificate, building control bodies are going to need to have a recommendation from a registered individual building inspector that they can actually issue that certificate. And then inspections of work, again, need to be carried out for a building control body by a registered building inspector. How might that look, and what might that look for us in construction phase? So the Building Act 1984 is still the overarching legislation. We've still got the Building Regulations 2010. We've still got the Building Approved Inspector Regulations 2010. But the building control bodies will either be the local authority, the building control approver, or the building safety regulator, and only the building safety regulator for the higher risk buildings. There'll be new regulations about the appointment of persons and industry competence, and about duty holders. So there'll be a new set of regulations about duty holders, and you'll recognise these because they mirror the CDM regulation duty holders. Those are client, principal designer, and principal contractor. So what do we have for those duty holders? It's going to be their duty to ensure that the work and the building complies with the building regulations. So the client will essentially have a duty to appoint principal designers and principal contractors who have the competence and capacity to carry out the design and construction in accordance with the building regulations. The designer will have to confirm that their design is capable of being constructed to meet the building regulations. And likewise, the principal contractor will have to confirm, once they've completed the building, that they have built the building in accordance with the building regulations. But this is where you can see the similarity with the CDM regulations and how this system is going to actually affect everybody in the built environment, because there is going to be a domestic client. And the CDM regulations, the contractor will assume the duties of the domestic client if there's only one contractor. If there's more than one contractor or a designer, then the principal contractor or the principal designer will assume the duties for the domestic client. So again, you can see how that's mirroring the CDM regulations and how the designers and contractors are going to be the duty holders for compliance with building regulations. How might this look in terms of process? An application for work on a high-risk building. We've got planning gateway 1, which is already in at the moment. So there's a consultation that occurs with the building safety regulator, and the building safety regulator gives advice and comments back to the planning authority. Once planning approval has been granted, an application is made to the building safety regulator, and the design is assessed, but we have duty holders who need to submit the information to the building safety regulator, and their proposals are assessed by the building safety regulator. The building safety regulator, as you see on the right there, has to seek advice of a registered building inspector before they can actually give permission. Once they're satisfied that the design is going to demonstrate compliance with the building regulations, they can give permission for that project to pass through gateway 2. So that is the design stage of the building. It then moves into construction stage. And so the contractor is the principal contractor and the duty holder for demonstrating compliance with the building regulations and ensuring that the building complies with the building regulations. The building safety regulator will make inspections during this and will need to seek the advice of a registered building inspector again as this work proceeds. And then before going through gateway 3 and before the building safety regulator grants permission for the building to be occupied, the building safety regulator will again seek advice from a registered building inspector to confirm that the construction is reasonable and complies with the regulations, and the contractor, the principal contractor, will also need to make a statement that their building has been constructed in compliance with the building safety regulator. This then allows the building safety regulator to grant permission for the building to be occupied, and then the building goes into the occupation phase, which the building safety regulator deals with under Part 4 of the Act, as we saw earlier. For non-higher risk buildings, we've got similar processes as we have now. You make an application for a building control to a building control body, either a local authority or a building control approver, an approved inspector. And then we have buildings that are going to be subject to the regulatory reform order or not subject to the regulatory reform order. But as you can see here, the duty holder system, it is still the duty of the designers and the contractors to design and construct a building in accordance with the building regulations and confirm that that is what they are doing. The building control bodies, the local authority or the building control approver, again must seek advice from a registered building inspector, an individual person, before they can carry out those restricted functions of plan certificates, final certificates, and site inspections. So we can see that the new duty holder regime and the competence demonstration is going to affect the whole of the built environment. If we start to have a quick look at occupation, the occupation phase is going to apply to those higher risk buildings and is going to be carried out by the building safety regulator. We can see they're 18 meters in height and more than 7 stories and containing at least 2 residential units. We're going to be monitoring the building safety risks in terms of spread of fire and in terms of structural safety. The accountable person is going to be a person with a legal estate in the possession of the building, or having a relevant repairing obligation. Higher risk buildings have got to be registered prior to occupation, as we've just seen. So they will go through that gateway 3, but you've got to register them with the building safety regulator before you're allowed to occupy that building. We've talked about the golden thread and about the information and documents. So documents, prescribed information is going to be required to be maintained. That prescribed information about safety risks is going to be required to be kept up to date. And then there's going to be a mandatory occurrence reporting system to report on any building safety risks that develop. As we mentioned about residents, they're going to have some a greater voice. And so building owners are going to have to introduce a residents engagement strategy so that they can demonstrate that they're engaging with residents. But as I mentioned previously, residents also have duties not to create a risk and also have a duty to cooperate with the accountable person. So what might that look like as a sort of flow chart? We've got the Building Safety Act now, which is covering the in-occupation phase. We've got new regulations that will be drafted to introduce a system of higher risk buildings in occupation and registration with the building safety regulator. So the accountable person must register their building before they're allowed to occupy. The accountable person will be a new duty holder that will have duties imposed on them via the legislation. There's some draft guidance and indication from the Health and Safety Executive about what safety case reports might look like and how we actually write those safety cases for demonstrating that our buildings are going to be safe in occupation. That document is already published, and there will be further updates as we develop safety cases for guidance on what a safety case has to include. Some numbers about the buildings that we've got there to show that it's quite a large piece of work that's going to be on there. Total number of high-rise residential buildings over 18 metres or more than 7 stories in England is estimated at 12,500. 6,500 are estimated in the private sector. And so we've got to get all of those buildings, all those existing buildings registered with the building safety regulator. So you can see that this is going to be an extensive task. All of those buildings are going to need safety cases written about them, and then applications from the accountable persons, they will have accountable persons, need to be made to the building safety regulator. So a big task ahead of us. Some of the other provisions that we've got about remediation of defects, relevant defects, so what's causing a building safety risk. And then some of the relevant buildings, they're now starting to talk about buildings with 2 dwellings at 11 metres high or 5 stories in terms of these remediation processes. So that's a slightly different definition to the high risk buildings that we've seen previously. Some of the building industry schemes about securing the safety of people and improving building standards. So we're going to be looking at some schemes to improve building standards and ensure that our buildings are safe so that people in the buildings are going to be safe in occupation. A new Homes Ombudsman, we've mentioned about this being developed, and this is due to come into being anytime now actually, but during this year. And it's going to be open to all developers, and then qualifying complaints. There's going to be a list of complaints that can be made and complaints about members of the Ombudsman process. And then there's legislation about new build home warranties. Developers must provide a purchaser with a warranty, and the Secretary of State may actually impose some requirements about the warranty system, and that will be via subsequent regulations that will be made. We've got information about construction products, about safety of those products, and about liabilities and costs should those products prove not to be safe in the way that they're being used. Amendments to the fire safety order that we've mentioned already. And then amendments to the architects legislation, amendments to the Architects Act 1997, discipline and continuing professional development requirements in relation to architects, and then changes to the Architects Registration Board in terms of fees and their functions. And that's going to require re-registration probably of architects through the life of their career. And then the final bit about housing complaints. Amendments are to be made to the Housing Act to allow complaints to be made through to the new housing ombudsman. Building safety risks is going to be required to be kept up to date. And then there's going to be a mandatory occurrence reporting system to report on any building safety risks that develop. As we mentioned about residents, they're going to have some a greater voice. And so building owners are going to have to introduce a residents engagement strategy so that they can demonstrate that they're engaging with residents. But as I mentioned previously, residents also have duties not to create a risk and also have a duty to cooperate with the accountable person. So what might that look like as a sort of flow chart? We've got the Building Safety Act now, which is covering the in-occupation phase. We've got new regulations that will be drafted to introduce a system of higher risk buildings in occupation and registration with the building safety regulator. So the accountable person must register their building before they're allowed to occupy. The accountable person will be a new duty holder that will have duties imposed on them via the legislation. There's some draft guidance and indication from the Health and Safety Executive about what safety case reports might look like and how we actually write those safety cases for demonstrating that our buildings are going to be safe in occupation. That document is already published, and there will be further updates as we develop safety cases for guidance on what a safety case has to include. Some numbers about the buildings that we've got there to show that it's quite a large piece of work that's going to be on there. Total number of high-rise residential buildings over 18 metres or more than 7 stories in England is estimated at 12,500. 6,500 are estimated in the private sector. And so we've got to get all of those buildings, all those existing buildings registered with the building safety regulator. So you can see that this is going to be an extensive task. All of those buildings are going to need safety cases written about them, and then applications from the accountable persons, they will have accountable persons, need to be made to the building safety regulator. So a big task ahead of us. Some of the other provisions that we've got about remediation of defects, relevant defects, so what's causing a building safety risk. And then some of the relevant buildings, they're now starting to talk about buildings with 2 dwellings at 11 metres high or 5 stories in terms of these remediation processes. So that's a slightly different definition to the high risk buildings that we've seen previously. Some of the building industry schemes about securing the safety of people and improving building standards. So we're going to be looking at some schemes to improve building standards and ensure that our buildings are safe so that people in the buildings are going to be safe in occupation. A new Homes Ombudsman, we've mentioned about this being developed, and this is due to come into being anytime now actually, but during this year. And it's going to be open to all developers, and then qualifying complaints. There's going to be a list of complaints that can be made and complaints about members of the Ombudsman process. And then there's legislation about new build home warranties. Developers must provide a purchaser with a warranty, and the Secretary of State may actually impose some requirements about the warranty system, and that will be via subsequent regulations that will be made. We've got information about construction products, about safety of those products, and about liabilities and costs should those products prove not to be safe in the way that they're being used. Amendments to the fire safety order that we've mentioned already, And then amendments to the architects legislation, amendments to the Architects Act 1997, discipline and continuing professional development requirements in relation to architects, and then changes to the Architects Registration Board in terms of fees and their functions. And that's going to require re-registration probably of architects through the life of their career. And then the final bit about housing complaints. Amendments are to be made to the Housing Act to allow complaints to be made through to the new Housing Ombudsman. Building Act has 11 schedules. And so again, these are giving more details about how the legislation will work and transfer some of those functions. And so there's a lot of detail in there about other consequential amendments and changes to other legislation in those 11 schedules to the Building Act. For further information, to finish off, before we take some questions, for further information, there's a website at the Health and Safety Executive, which is now dedicated to the Building Safety Regulator. So there are pages dedicated to the Building Safety Regulator on the Health and Safety Executive's website. There's a good website for looking at the legislation called legislation.gov.uk, and that's where you can actually see all legislation for the UK on that website. But the Building Safety Act itself is now up on that website, and that's where you'll be able to see as they come into force all the subsequent statutory instruments and regulations that will be made over the coming years in relation to building safety and the building industry. And then the Industry Safety Steering Group, there's a website on the gov.uk website there where you can actually see the reports of the Industry Safety Steering Group. And as you can see at the top right there, that's chaired by Dame Judith Hackett, and that is promoting the industry competence regime that is coming through the competence assessment panels. And so we'll see all of that coming through in the next 12 to 18 months. That is a quick run through over the Building Safety Act and the implications that will have for the whole industry. And that's the emphasis that I want to say. It is for the whole of the built environment, and it will have implications for all of us. So from there, I will take some questions. I think we've got some questions through on the chat already. So we'll run through some of those and we'll see how we get on time-wise for those. So I've got a question from John. Can you please clarify if care homes, hospitals will indeed be included? Under construction, design and construction, care homes and hospitals will be included, but at the moment, the proposal was still to have the height restriction of 7 stories or over 18 metres. However, the regulations which are going to define the height and classification are still to be consulted on, so we will have to wait for the detailed regulations on that. Next question I've got, can you advise whether halls of residence and similar will be treated as dwellings under the Act? That is, again, I think going to be subject to this regulations under consultation. It talks about residential units in the Act, but it will be subject to consultation under the regulations, and we will have to just wait and see what that definition comes out as at the end. Next question from Damien. Please, can you clarify the transitional arrangements for gateways 2 and 3? The HSE website currently states new buildings where works on or after the 1st of April 2023 must follow the gateway approval process. That's not yet in force in terms of gateway 2 and 3. Gateway 1 is in force through the planning system, but that's just a consultation. Gateway 2 and 3 at the moment are due for implementation from October 2023, but again they will be subject to secondary legislation and regulations that will be consulted on over the next 12 months or so. Question from Damien. Please, can you clarify gateway and approval requirements for building work, e.g. cladding carried out on in-scope existing buildings? Yep, so any work that's going to be carried out on high-risk buildings when the regulations come into force will have to go through the building safety regulator and will go through that building those gateway 2 and 3 systems. So all work on high-risk buildings, once we've got the final definition through the regulations, when the Gateway 2 and Gateway 3 system introduced, will have to go through the building safety regulator. Just having a look now. Don't think there's any more questions on the chat. So I think we're going to open microphones. Yeah, we're going to open the microphones, and if anybody would like to ask a question, then please just, I think, raise hands. Yeah, or yeah, if you could raise your hand, and we'll see that, and we can try and answer any questions. Right, just got another question on the chat. They have a significant student accommodation scheme commencing on site in September 2022 with completion 2024. Student accommodation, again, is one of the ones that we'd need to look on the definition of residential unit, and I think might be subject to the consultation on the new regulations as well. What I will actually do, Graham, I will take. We've had a couple of questions on the student accommodation issue. I will take that away, and I will have a look into that in more detail and provide a response on that. In terms of whether you get caught by Gateway 2 and Gateway 3, for buildings that are either starting now or are subject to building regulation applications now, there will be some transitional arrangements to transition those projects over to the building safety regulator. As of yet, though, we don't know how that transitional arrangement will work. And again, so we will need to look at subsequent regulations and transitional provisions as they get published. Okay, so I think we've come to the end of questions on the chat there. We're just about on time. Apologies for the slightly late start to the webinar as well. As ever, please feel free to send questions through to us. The webinar, the slides, and the recording will be made available, and you can contact Kaylee if you need copies of those. But thank you for your time today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.